Hi Joshua Tree family, Jeremy here. Great to have you joining us online. Perhaps you're not a regular part of our church community, but you're checking us out today, and it's great to have you with us as well. Our context and our life stage may vary, but I suspect that our wider situation is probably getting to all of us about now. Perhaps it's starting to get to you if you've had days and weeks on end working from home. Or maybe you've had kids at home and you've had that unexpected pressure of changing up your routines dramatically in the home, trying to occupy the kids and all the noise and chaos that goes with that. Perhaps you've been wanting hands-on help if that's your kind of situation, but there's that dilemma of not being able to involve grandparents, those who are most at risk, who normally help out in various ways. My wife Hayley, she was just saying that there's this accumulated sense of her just missing the face-to-face contact, which is so much part of our rhythms of daily life. And conversation with other adults, she's just feeling really housebound and missing that wider engagement with people. For me personally, my role at KCC, the workload has actually increased rather than decreased. So that's a bit of a different situation for me. But whatever you're facing, and whatever your response to that is right now, Jesus wants to meet you exactly where you're at. Now we're continuing a teaching series, and we've been looking at Jesus' I am statements. We started in the book of John, and now we're jumping into another book that John wrote, the book of Revelation, where he continues highlighting who Jesus is. I really wanted to start by asking the question, why should you even bother tuning in today? It's a different medium, watching on video. It's a bit like, the temptation to flick channels, see what other churches are doing and not stick with it. But I guess I want to say to you that Jesus has something really relevant to you today. I think he wants to shake up all that you're thinking about right now and rearrange it. And he wants to do that by showing you clearly who he is to you right now. When we start to see Jesus and who he is, it kind of changes what we've been thinking about. It puts things in perspective. And this kind of putting things in perspective is exactly what John was doing to those he wrote to all those years ago, back in around AD 96. So the people back then, they were facing turbulent times too. And particularly those who were Christians. See, under the reign of the Emperor Domitian, some 40,000 Christians were put to death. And he's this really fearsome kind of figure in a way, but terribly insecure as well. So you think Voldemort kind of figure from Harry Potter, this person who wants to control everything, but he's just terribly fearful inside of any threat to his power and control. So one of the key ways that he tried to maintain control over his empire was by worship. He'd had these temples set up, and you'd go to the temple and you'd throw some incense on the altar, and you'd say that Caesar is Lord. Kind of bow the knee to Caesar as if he were God. And obviously some people had problems with that. Many Romans just conformed, as it just became one of the other gods. But for those who resisted, you were seen as a traitor, and you could be executed or even exiled to a prison island like Patmos, where John happens to find himself when he's writing this letter. Now, John was a pastor of the church at Ephesus, and no doubt all this uncertainty was just on his heart as he's separated off from his people, the people that he loves dearly. No doubt that just broke his heart to feel that separation. He wants to write to them. He wants to give them some words of hope, something that could be an anchor for them in this period of turbulence, like being thrown about in rough seas. He wants to give them something that they can cling to, that's going to hold them fast, come what may. And John's words to those readers have the ability to do the same thing for us. John's readers, they had so many things that were dear to them, that were just kind of unstable and under threat at the time that they lived. And I wonder, how's your stability going today? Where would you rate yourself? Think about what the last couple of weeks have been like for you. Now, I think some of us may have this sense of safety, and perhaps that's because we know that what's being said about the coronavirus is that those of us who are young are only affected in mild ways, and so maybe you don't particularly fear your own life and health being under threat. Or maybe some of you do still fear that. You imagine this worst case of this virus only coming in that form, but then for some reason it does something more drastic to you or someone close to you. Maybe think of those around you who are vulnerable, perhaps older family members, those with particular health conditions like a heart condition maybe that puts them at a high risk category, and your mind plays out that worst case scenario. Now in the reflection time, Danny's going to talk a bit about belonging. You see, we have this sense that to have a life that is enjoyable and rich, we have this connectedness to groups and communities that are significant in our lives. Perhaps for you that's in your workplace, perhaps it's in your sporting team or in your church. You're feeling the loss of that face-to-face interaction as you've maybe video called in for the small groups we've done via video, but it's just not the same, and you're really feeling that. Those places where you feel just totally at home and comfortable, where you fit in. And maybe this whole situation has thrown that all up in the air. It's made you feel like you don't know where you fit anymore. You're a bit dislocated from those whom you're connected well to. Some of you are tuning in and working from home, as you have been for some time. And maybe work was that place where you had that connectedness, and now that's gone. Perhaps others watching have lost work, and that's just added in more instability, and you feel like you're drowning in this sea that knocks you about. You don't know, you can't get your bearings on where you're at. In that sense, you're like those who are in the Roman Empire, whose lives were so uncertain, so at threat, so unstable. Now, what's John going to give them? What's he going to do to them, those his readers who are dear to him on his heart? And what's he going to give us in light of what we're facing? He's going to show us who Jesus is right now. And that actually changes everything. It changes our outlook. But perhaps that's not what you're looking for. Perhaps that's not what you thought you needed right now. Maybe what you thought you really needed was a vaccine that works, one that can be distributed effectively around the world. Or maybe you're after a consistent message, what should happen with schools and kids. Or, if this more permanent or longer term or more complete lockdown might be something that really is effective in quashing the spread of the disease. There have been any number of things that Jesus' followers were looking for back in John's day. But this picture of Jesus, who he is right now, is what Jesus wanted to give them. It's what he thought they really needed. And if you're watching, it's what he wants to give you and I as well. So we're about to dive into Revelation chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. But before we kind of strap ourselves in for that ride, I want you to make sure that your imagination is switched on. See, John's going to give us some really vivid, rich pictures, and they're designed to work on us, to stick with us, to stay with us long after we've read them. So they don't just work on our mind and our emotions, that they're actually designed to capture our whole imagination. Now they say that the most effective advertising is the advertising that can capture our imagination. And I'm a bit of an Apple fanboy, and also being a web designer, I just love the Apple website. There's something in there that kind of sucks me into that whole world. There's this, I'm a font nerd, so I love seeing the fonts they've used, the really clear hierarchy of headings and smaller fonts, this order. The animations are really slick and smooth. There's this appreciation for beauty. It kind of taps into something fairly deep inside of me, something that I feel like I was made for or long for. And that's how these images that John's going to give us of Jesus are designed to work. So can I encourage you to let them work on you in that way? Here we go, Revelation 1, 9 to 20. I, John, your brother and companion in the suffering and kingdom and patient endurance that are ours in Jesus, was on the island of Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. On the Lord's day I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet, which said, write on a scroll what you see and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp, double-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I'm alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later. The mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and of the 7 golden lampstands is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches." Are you drawn into John's experience? So here he is, exiled on this prison island, Patmos, and suddenly he hears a voice behind him like a trumpet, and he turns to see the voice. And he's given a message to write on a scroll. All that he sees is to write down on the scroll and send to the 7 churches, these churches spread around the Roman Empire. What comes next is like this collage or photo montage, this multi-layered and multifaceted picture of Jesus. And at first reading it, it sounds pretty bizarre to us. You've got to understand that these images are really closely connected to the Old Testament. There's lots of references in here, and they become the key to unlock what John's saying here. In verse 12, John turns to see the voice. And what does he see? Well, he sees 7 golden lampstands, and among them, the lampstands, was someone dressed like a son of man, verse 13. And verse 20 tells us the lampstands are the 7 churches. So someone is standing among the lampstands. And this is huge. Where is Jesus when his people are suffering? Is he kind of above them, up in the clouds, looking down on them? Is he kind of shut outside, looking in like some kind of surveillance system, watching what they're doing? No, he's right in the middle of his people. He's right in the middle of us, in our midst, with us, experiencing what we're experiencing by our side. Jesus knows exactly what you're facing, and he's with you right now. He's like a son of man, verse 13. And this is something of his humanity, but there's also something more. You see, back in Daniel chapter 7, there's this figure described as one like a son of man who approaches the throne of the Ancient of Days, the Ancient of Days being God himself. And the Son of Man comes to this Ancient of Days figure, and he's given power and glory and this ability to rule over this kingdom that will extend forever and ever. This figure, Jesus, who appears to John, is also described as being dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. And this is describing that clothing that a high priest would wear, the one who went into the temple to make sacrifices for the people. The role of this high priest is like a bridge builder. You see, people's sin, their uncleanness before God, their impurity, separated them from God who is sinless and holy. But the sacrifices were designed to bridge the gap, to take away guilt, to cleanse. And these sashes, they were worn in 2 different positions. One was around the waist, like a belt. The priest would wear that when he would go in to do his priestly duties, sacrifice and ritual and whatnot. But when he was finished, he would fix the sash around his chest to say his work was done. Here we have this picture of Jesus, the great high priest, whose work is finished. The greatest of bridge builders, who's bridged this chasm between us and God and made us acceptable to be in God's very presence. Now in verse 14, we see that the hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow. And that description is the same description used in Daniel 7 to describe the Ancient of Days. So Jesus is not only the Son of Man, the one who's given this power and glory, But he's also the one who was right there in the beginning, the one who sits on the throne. He is God. And in verse 14 we see that his eyes are like blazing fire. And we hear people say that the eyes are the window to the soul. And here Jesus has these eyes that just seem to pierce right through us. Think X-ray vision, but don't think, looking in your bones. Think your inner being, your inner self, your inner person. Jesus sees all that and there's no hiding before him. He knows what's going on for you. And this burning sense is the kind of burning that wants to burn away impurities so that we can stand clean in his sight. 15, we see his feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace. Now this is also a reference to the book of Daniel earlier in the book. There's this vision of a statue with different parts, and each part represents a different kingdom. The thing is, all the kingdoms crumble and fall except for one, the one at the bottom, that's represented, pictured by these bronze feet. So here we have Jesus, the king of this unending kingdom, the one that was promised. In verse 15, his voice was like that of rushing waters. And I've never been to Niagara Falls, but I see those boats, those ferries, pictured so close to the water. It actually makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. I don't know how I'd feel being that close. You can imagine the deafening sound of the water falling. It's this powerful water that drowns out other sounds. And Jesus' voice, it's like that. It's powerful. It's deafening. It's able to drown out other sounds, other voices. The other thing with rushing water is there's something soothing and kind of calming about it. I think Jesus' voice also has that kind of quality to it. Verse 16, we get this image of Jesus in his right hand holding 7 stars. And in verse 20, we're told again that the 7 stars represent the angels of the 7 churches. So Jesus is kind of in control. He's got the churches in his hand and the ones who look after them. I think there's also something more going on with this image too. You see, back in the day, the known planets and stars became another way to prop up the Roman emperor in the minds of the people, another form of propaganda. So the Roman emperor was pictured being surrounded by the stars and planets, and the Greek goddess Hecate was actually pictured holding stars in her hand. Here, does Caesar hold the world in his hand? Or Hecate? Perhaps some of the big figures throughout history, have they held the world in their hand? A Pol Pot, a Stalin, a Hitler, a Donald Trump, a Kim Jong-un. Any of these guys really hold the power in the world? No, John's giving us a counter image. Jesus is the one with the stars in his hand. Also in verse 16, we get this image of a sharp double-edged sword coming out of Jesus' mouth. I think the picture is not a long sword, but one that's short, used for kind of close combat. I understand this being that Jesus is like the surgeon with a scalpel. He really wants to get to work on us, his people, in making us pure and clean, a people fit for himself and his kingdom. The last image in this section is Jesus having this face being like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. And the highest blessing that you could consider if you're living the Old Testament was to have God's face shine on you. That was desired above anything else. And we see Jesus' face shines with the brilliance of the sun. People who are attached to Jesus, they have his blessing, the blessing of God himself. Now, how does John respond to all this? Well, he responds like many who are confronted by the reality of God. We see in verse 17, when I saw him, I fell down at his feet as though dead. He's just had a brilliant but terrifying picture of Jesus. But what does Jesus do? Jesus places his hand on John and he says, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I'm alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. And Tony's going to focus on Jesus being the living one next week. But my focus today is Jesus saying he's the first and the last. What does that mean, being the first and the last? Well, he's picking up God's own words back in Isaiah. I'm going to read a number of passages to you. They'll come up on the screen. Isaiah 41 verse 4. Who has done this and carried it through, calling forth generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, with the first of them, and with the last, I am He. Isaiah 43 verse 10. Before me no God was formed, nor will there be one after me. Isaiah 44 verse 6. I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me there is no God. Isaiah 48 verse 12. I am He, I am the first and the last. And Jesus takes these words and he says, that's me. I'm the one who brackets all of human history. You see, Jesus is over all the events of history. That includes turbulent times, times of plague, of disaster, of war. It includes this spread of a disease that we're trying to come to terms with as a whole world. And ultimately, history isn't decided by Caesar, by the rise and fall of these dominant world powers. Jesus is before and after the coronavirus. Jesus is the first and the last word. In chapter 1 verse 8, God says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, who is, who was, and who is to come, the Almighty. And in 21 verse 6, God says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And then at the end of the book, Jesus takes these three kind of related terms and he describes them, uses them to apply them to himself. Verse 22:13, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. It's like saying Jesus is the A to Z. He's the constant through every situation in history, from start through to finish, beginning to end. But there's more. You see, the word for beginning here is the word arche, which we get our word archetype. Jesus is also the pattern of the true human. He's the first one, and we're all to be made in his likeness, to conform to who he is and what he's like. And Jesus is also the end point, the telos, the goal, where everything is headed. So for us, for people, that means we're all to be shaped in his likeness, and it's only when we get there that we've reached what we were designed to be. But then for everything else, for things in creation, they reach their end when they're shaped by Jesus and taken to his chosen endpoint. Now the tapestry illustration, I think, is really helpful, and it's true. So often what we see from our perspective, when Jesus says he's the first and the last, we're going to see the tangles of the strings underneath the design. But all the time Jesus has the other side in view. That's what he's looking at, this complete and good design that he's working as he stands over all of history. That's what it means for him to be the first and the last. So what? So what does it mean for Jesus to be the first and the last for us today? Firstly, one, Jesus is big. It means Jesus looms larger than the current threat of the coronavirus. It's a simple point, but I think it's important to state. He's bigger than all that we're threatened to lose, be it our lifestyle, our community, our sense of belonging and connectedness, our employment, our investments, our financial stability, our own health, even the death of those near to us. Jesus is bigger than all of that. I like what Paul Tripp wrote about the coronavirus, about being afraid of it, because it's a balance, isn't it? He says, be afraid, but don't give way to fear. There's this appropriate concern when we live in a time of uncertainty with real threats in a world that is broken and not yet what it will one day be. Yet, when we only see the threat, when we keep looking at it, when that's the continual thing we give our time and attention to it, it grows to something that's out of proportion. That's all we can see, and Jesus is squashed out of our viewpoint. We can't see him anymore. When we realise that Jesus is big and we see him that way, things recede to their proper place. We can be afraid without giving way to fear. Secondly, Jesus is good. I think this is really important to state. Jesus is in control. He is holding the world in his hands, but sometimes Christians say it like it's, a bit cliche. They're a bit detached or unfeeling. It's like they don't really get what's going on, the seriousness of it, its devastating impact. It's this kind of fatalism. What will happen, that kind of thing. But that's not the Jesus we see here. He's not a tyrant. Jesus isn't about taking life. As the first and the last, he's this tender person who moves close to his people. To John, who was just falling on his face, afraid and as though dead, Jesus reaches out his hand and he touches him. And he says, don't be afraid. Jesus does have the whole world in his hands, but he's also with us in all that we find hard. And that means we can speak to him about it. There's no need to hold back. It makes sense that we speak openly to him about what's on our hearts, what's troubling us, the way that all this situation is impacting us, how it's different from what we wanted and hoped for. Thirdly, it means we can be confident. And in the messages that are happening in our world, one of the key sources of hope that you'll hear being said is that we're all in this together. And that's true, and I can see a lot of constructive impact. I've actually been a bit taken aback at how some of the bigger tensions happening in the world between countries like the US and China seem to have been put to the side, and to recognise this common problem and this common good of humanity. So I'm not downplaying that, but there's more to this than that. Not only are we in this together, but we're in it with Jesus by our side, and that's just reason to be confident. You know, world leaders can do good things at times and not so good things at other times. We've all seen some pretty horrific things happen through world history. But Jesus sticks with us by our side through thick and thin. Jesus rules over all history. He's the first and the last, and we can cry out to him for relief, for cure in the midst of this pandemic. We can cry out to him, may your kingdom come. May you put right everything that's wrong with this world, all that's chaotic and painful, all the havoc that's being wreaked. May you bring an end to it. May you return, Lord Jesus. May you restore this broken world. And in the meantime, give us a sense of your closeness. Give us the ability to endure suffering. Shape us in your likeness. Purge us of our impurities. Help us keep things in perspective.